Welcome to Raaonline. Today's topic of discussion is third and fourth ventricle. The competency of the topic is describe and demonstrate parts, boundaries and features of third and fourth ventricle. So let's see the third ventricle first under the following subheadings: introductions, communications, boundaries, recesses, tela choroidae and applied aspect. So in this is the third ventricle. This is the connecting ventricle between the lateral ventricle and the above and the fourth ventricle below. So third ventricle, this is the sagittal section of the brain and this is the coronal section of the brain. So it is a irregular cavity of the diencephalon which is like a midline slit like cavity. So in the medial surface, that is in the sagittal section, this is the area of third ventricle which is irregular. In the coronal section, it is like a slit like cavity in between the two thalamus. So this is thalamus of either side. So this is also a thalamus as well as hypothalamus. So it is a cavity present between the, in this section, this is the thalamus and this is the area for hypothalamus. So the sagittal section, the section passes through the third ventricle. So this is the third ventricle. Let's see the extent of third ventricle. So the third ventricle is extending from the lamina terminalis to the cerebral aqueduct of midbrain. So this is the anterior aspect and this is the posterior aspect. This is the enlarged view of third ventricle. So this is the area of third ventricle and this is the lamina terminalis. So lamina terminalis anteriorly and this is the cerebral aqueduct. So the cavity of the midbrain is known as cerebral aqueduct and this is the cranial most part of the cerebral aqueduct. So it extends from the lamina terminalis to the cerebral aqueduct and it is lined by ciliated columnar epithelium as well as the lining cells are ependymal cells of the ventricles. In this ventricular cavity, we can appreciate this adhesion. This is known as interthalamic adhesion which runs within the cavity of the third ventricle and which connects the two thalamus. So the interthalamic adhesion connects right and left thalamus. Let's see the communications. So anteriorly, so this is the third ventricle enlarged view and this is the interventricular foramen through which it has a communication with the lateral ventricle above and below. This is the cerebral aqueduct, otherwise known as aqueduct of Sylvius. It has a communication with the fourth ventricle. So this is the lateral ventricle. Imagine this is the lateral ventricle through the interventricular foramen. It has a communication with the third ventricle. So from the cerebral aqueduct, it has a connection with the fourth ventricle. So this is the fourth, this is the third and this is the lateral ventricle. So here you can appreciate the interventricular foramen and this is the cerebral aqueduct. Within the cavity you can appreciate the thalamus. Let's see the boundaries. So this is the anterior wall. So the anterior wall is formed above downwards by anterior column of fornix. So this is the anterior column of fornix, anterior commissure. Then this is the anterior commissure and the lamina terminalis. This is the lamina terminalis. So these three structures forms the anterior wall. Anterior column of fornix, anterior commissure and the lamina terminalis. And the posterior wall. So this is the posterior wall. So the posterior wall is formed by the pineal gland. So this is the pineal gland. So the posterior wall is formed by pineal gland. Posterior commissure. So the pineal gland has two lamina. So the superior lamina and the inferior lamina. So the superior lamina is known as habenular commissure. The inferior is known as posterior commissure. So this is the posterior commissure. And the commencement of cerebral aqueduct. So this is the area for cerebral aqueduct. So these are the relations in the posterior wall: pineal gland, posterior commissure and the cerebral aqueduct. Let's see the roof. So the roof of the third ventricle is mainly by the ependyma that stretches across the upper limit of thalamus. So this is the thalamus. So the ependyma stretches across the thalamus which is known as stria medullaris thalamus. Anteroposteriorly, the roof extends from the interventricular foramen to the habenular commissure. Already I have told this is the pineal gland. It has two stalks or lamina, the superior and inferior. Superior is known as habenular commissure. So this is habenular commissure which forms the roof, and the posterior commissure and the pineal gland forms the posterior wall. In the floor, we can appreciate the structures forming the floor here. So this is the optic chiasma, tuber cinereum and the infundibulum of the pituitary gland. So this is optic chiasma, tuber cinereum and the infundibulum of pituitary gland, as well as the stalk of pituitary gland, mammillary bodies. Deep to that there is a posterior perforating substance and the tegmentum of midbrain. So these structures forms the floor. So all these structures forms the floor of interpeduncular fossa. So this is the area for interpeduncular fossa, except tegmentum and the optic chiasma. So this is the area of floor of interpeduncular fossa. So from above downwards we can appreciate the tuber cinereum and the infundibulum of the pituitary stalk, mammillary bodies on either side. So this is the mammillary body and this is tuber cinereum. Deep to that is the posterior perforating substance which is pierced by the branches of posterior cerebral artery. So let's see the structures present in the lateral wall. So the lateral wall is the extent of hypothalamic sulcus. It is a vein groove that is extending between the interventricular foramen above. So this is the interventricular foramen above, below by the cerebral aqueduct. As well as it is this sulcus, this is the hypothalamic sulcus that divides this area into upper larger part and the smaller lower part. So the upper larger part is occupied by the medial surface of anterior two-thirds of the thalamus, and the smaller lower part is occupied by the hypothalamus, which is continuous with the floor of the third ventricle.